Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Jacobs, and today we're going to talk about intergenerational trauma for Social Work 727 at the BCU School of Social Work. So, what is intergenerational trauma? Intergenerational trauma refers to trauma that is passed on from a trauma survivor to their descendants. It can also be referred to as transgenerational trauma or multi-generational trauma, or I've even heard it referred to as generational trauma. People that experience intergenerational trauma may experience symptoms, reactions, patterns, and emotional or psychological effects from trauma experienced by previous generations, not just limited to parents or grandparents. Those that are affected by intergenerational trauma might experience symptoms similar to PTSD, including hypervigilance, anxiety, and mood dysregulation. However, because the individual did not directly experience the trauma themselves, they will not experience flashbacks or intrusive memories. They experience trauma symptoms and trauma responses from events that did not occur to them. Rather, the response is inherited genetically. Because stress responses are linked to more physical health issues, intergenerational trauma can also manifest as medical issues, including heart disease, stroke, or even early death. Intergenerational trauma can also be the result of oppression, including racial trauma, which we talked about a couple modules ago, or other types of systemic oppression. The effects of intergenerational trauma have been documented in descendants of refugees, residential schools, and Holocaust survivors, which just demonstrates that this type of trauma continues to impact populations for generations after a collective trauma has occurred. So, we're going to get into biology and we're going to talk about epigenetics. So, epigenetics is a scientific field that investigates how the environment influences genes, altering not just the DNA sequence that we have, but how it's read and utilized. Epigenetics potentially explains why effects of trauma can endure long after the immediate threat is gone, and why it's also implicated in the diverse pathways by which trauma is transmitted to future generations. Mark Wallen's book, It Didn't Start With You, explores how this happens. Epigenetics has shown remarkable potential since its inception in the mid 20th century. However, it's crucial to acknowledge that epigenetics is not an exact science. Solid conclusions about epigenetic inheritance and its health implications require further research. Epigenetics represents just one facet of a complex interplay between numerous biological and environmental factors. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Dr. Rachel Yehuda, and I might be pronouncing her name incorrectly, so I do apologize, and 9/11. So after the Twin Towers collapsed on September 11, 2001, clinicians at the School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in Manhattan offered to check on anyone who'd been in the area for exposure to toxins. Among those who came in for evaluation were 187 pregnant women. Many were in shock and they were at risk for developing PTSD. Dr. Yehuda and her colleagues also wondered if their fetuses were at risk. She led a trauma team and they quickly trained health professionals to evaluate and, if needed, treat the women. They monitored them through their pregnancies and beyond, and when the babies were born, they were smaller than usual, the first sign that the trauma of the World Trade Center had impacted them. 9 months later, Dr. Yehuda and her treatment team examined 38 women and their infants when they came in for a wellness visit. Psychological evaluations revealed that many of the mothers had developed PTSD, and those with PTSD had unusually low levels of the hormone cortisol, which was a feature that researchers were coming to associate with PTSD. So let me pause for a moment and talk a little bit about what cortisol is. Like many other hormones that regulate your bodily functions, cortisol is produced by your adrenal glands. So think about cortisol as your body's natural alarm system. It's the primary hormone involved in stress response, and it works alongside the brain regions that we've already talked about in prior modules to regulate your mood and your motivation and fear responses. Cortisol is produced by your adrenal glands, which are small and they kind of look like triangles, and they're located on top of each of your kidneys. And cortisol has several key functions. It helps manage the utilization of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. It suppresses inflammation. It maintains blood pressure, raises blood sugar levels, regulates your sleep-wake cycle, boosts energy to manage stress. It helps to restore equilibrium once the stress has passed. During stressful times, cortisol shuts off systems like digestion to focus energy where it's needed. Cortisol also provides anti-inflammatory assistance as part of the preparation for any tissue repairs that are needed in your body. Your brain signals the adrenal glands if more cortisol is needed or when it can reset to normal. So, to go back to Dr. Yehuda, the saliva of the 9-month-old babies from the women with PTSD after 9/11 showed low cortisol levels as well. The effect was most prominent in babies whose mothers had been in their third trimester on 9/11. The 9/11 babies were also impacted in the womb, with those in the third trimester having significantly lower cortisol levels. At this wellness visit, mothers who had PTSD and also had low cortisol were more likely to report that their 9-month-olds were unusually anxious and afraid of strangers. Unfortunately, Dr. Yehuda did not get funding to follow the babies into adulthood. However, in the decades since, research by Dr. Yehuda and her trauma group and others has confirmed that adverse experiences very likely influence the next generation through multiple pathways. The most apparent route runs through parental behavior, but influences during gestation and even changes in eggs and sperm play a role. Dr. Yehuda has also worked with children of Holocaust survivors that have PTSD, and they tended to have low cortisol levels even if they did not have PTSD. So if the child of a Holocaust survivor, so the Holocaust survivor was diagnosed with PTSD and the child did not have PTSD, still had low cortisol levels. So as Dr. Yehuda had suspected, low cortisol levels relate to high vulnerability to PTSD. So, continuing to talk about science for a bit, the first point to make is that studies have shown that people diagnosed with severe mental illness and severe health issues can sometimes have too high levels of cortisol. So, we've been talking about too low levels, but sometimes people can have too high levels. Having your stress response system activated for a prolonged period of time can just put too much cortisol in your system for too long. As we talked about, your adrenal glands have a lot to do with your fear system. So if your adrenal glands are constantly elevated, you can have too much cortisol in your system. This is bound to influence your physical and mental health. This can happen due to genetics, like we've been talking about, or to life experiences that lead to PTSD and complex PTSD. But please don't jump to the conclusion that there's a clear-cut case that elevated cortisol makes people vulnerable to PTSD and complex PTSD. There are also some indications that some people have too little, as we talked about on the last slide. What this all suggests is that there is an imbalance that can lead to a diverse range of physical and emotional effects. Basically, there's what they call a derangement of cortisol levels. What Dr. Yehuda has determined, to go back to her, is that the body regulates the stress response through a complicated feedback mechanism. A rise in cortisol levels will prompt the body to produce less of the hormone, which could drive up the numbers and responsiveness of the glucocorticoid receptors. Given epigenetics and other changes that occur with sustained responses to trauma, that feedback loop that we're talking about can become recalibrated. In people who have already endured trauma, their stress systems can be sensitized and their cortisol levels diminished, which in turn increases their adrenal response to further trauma, another thing that leads to PTSD. So I want to talk a little bit about resilience. I know that this is a word that almost everyone is familiar with. It is a buzzword. It's used if you're going to work in trauma. It's basically known as the ability of a person to recover and show early and effective adaptation following a traumatic event. Individuals can regain a sense of well-being despite trauma when we're talking about resiliency, and sometimes emerge through this concept even stronger. The interaction between a person and their environment can promote resilience. Resiliency is talked a lot if you are going to work with children and teens. Um, and the idea is, if we want to engage children through a resilient lens, some of the things to do are to try to help them have strong and stable relationships, which can include a relationship with their therapist or a social worker, to help them feel capable. This isn't just with children and teens, really with anyone. When an individual is given tools and skills to help them cope with their traumatic experiences, they can start to believe in their ability to heal and calm themselves. So those are some of the things. I do just want to say one more time that there are many buzzwords in social work. Resilience can be one, but if resilience is discussed in an empowering way, it can be really helpful for clients. So, kind of speaking about that, as we're talking about intergenerational trauma, it's a good idea to take a moment and reflect on language around trauma work. Words like broken, victim, and damaged can reinforce a sense of helplessness and hopelessness. Also, focusing solely on healing can imply that trauma is linear and that it has an endpoint. And for many people, that's not the reality. Trauma is complex and ongoing, and it takes strength and resilience for individuals to navigate. And trauma work that focuses just on the negatives is exhausting, both for the provider and for the individual. So, how do we shift language? Hopefully, some of these things have already been shifted, but I'm aware that that's not the truth across the board. So, I want to start off by saying please don't ever use the word victim if you have the option. I know there are some places that do use the word victim, a lot of law officer, if you're going to work in law, legal, but you can maybe be the person who changes that. Use the word survivor. I've been doing this since I started working in Brooklyn at the beginning of my career, and I watched as teens around me literally move differently as I called them survivors of community violence or survivors of gun violence. These were teens that had been in juvenile justice facilities, had been called victims. And so shifting that narrative, calling them survivors, listening to themselves call themselves survivors was huge. Try not to use the word broken. I suggest using the word impacted. There are other ones as well. I think that this implies that there is trauma without weakness, and focusing on growth and empowerment in conversations. There is so much power to the words we use. Words have the ability to shape perceptions and experiences. Using a strength-based empowerment model can create more supportive community and overall just shift collective healing. So that's the end of this lecture. Hopefully you all stayed to listen to the biology piece, and I hope that you all have a nice day. Thank you.